about to start. We'll talk about code or whatever we'll talk about today. It's about to start, so please hang tight while I check that everything is okay. Sound check, camera check, lights check. How's my hair? Oh, wait, I don't have any hair. Maybe put some pants on and I am good to go. So get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and let's write some code together, shall we? What we have on the menu today is a follow-up to what we have been doing last week, and it is kind of a crazy idea, but hear me out. What if we had knobs that are not knobs? That's the idea. All right, let's give some context to begin with. We are working on a series of audio effects using the JSFX language in REAPER. Lately, we have been working on a plugin called Auto Mixer, and for that plugin, I think it makes sense to have knobs that exist in the user interface as opposed to the default sliders you get using JSFX. Let me show you. These are the kinds of sliders you get by default in JSFX. Very minimalistic in terms of design. It's not fancy at all. And then this is the kind of thing that you can do in JSFX using the so-called user interface. Super fancy, huh? And for the better part of 1.5 years at this point, I think, we have been using the default JSFX sliders. And last week, we started experimenting with these kinds of knobs, though much less fancy than this, much simpler than this. But we experimented with drawing knobs on the user interface. It's kind of tricky. It's not as simple as one may think. And even when you do everything right, you still don't get like perfect rendering. For instance, this kind of aliasing that happens here, it's very difficult to treat this kind of situation. So that got me thinking, what is the purpose of the knobs in the first place? What do they do? If you look at plugins like perhaps the plugin that I reviewed for Toucan this Sunday, so yesterday. If you haven't watched, go to Toucan Studios after the stream is over here, of course. Go to Toucan Studios, the YouTube channel, and watch my review of Limiter 3. Anyway, what do the knobs do? They let you change the value, of course, and to some extent, they show you the range. In this case, the range isn't labeled, but you do get a notion that here you're halfway to the left, for instance. So a knob is doing two things. It's letting you change a number by clicking and dragging, and it is showing you a notion of progress, let's say. And if you want to follow the more traditional approach for audio effects, you probably want some knobs, perhaps some sliders, because that's typically how these kinds of user interfaces are designed. We see knobs here and in many other instances, in many other places in digital audio workstations. But take a step out of the digital audio workstation world And you will see something that is not quite like that. For instance, and I realize that Inkscape is not going to win any design contests, but still, when you have, for instance, a shape, you have all these numbers that you can input. And some of them even have this notion of range or progress, in the sense that you have a minimum and maximum value. So there is this notion of where you are in relation to the total. But you don't see many knobs. You do see a couple of sliders. In 2 cases, you see sliders here, but the rest of the interface is all about these boxes with the values, the actual values. And in the case of Inkscape, you can input the values directly by typing in a value. You can go plus and minus, but you cannot click and drag. And that makes sense, because if you click and drag, you're dragging the numbers. So that's more natural in every other interface that is not a digital audio workstation or audio related thing. And it's not only Inkscape, many apps work like this. When you have to input many numbers, they give you these kinds of input boxes. Now, let's see another example. And Apple is famous for having good user interfaces. And still they don't have knobs. You input the numbers, or you go plus and minus. If there is a series of options, drop-down menu. But you don't see any knobs here. Even when there are lots of numbers to input, for instance here, just several boxes with labels. I really like this. It takes very little space. Depending on the arrangement of the buttons, you can make some clever things happen. For instance, here, I think that they lost the opportunity of putting these 4 boxes in a cross, so that the top would be at the top and right would be at the right, and that kind of thing. So by clever placement and arrangement of the boxes, and having something as simple as a little box with a number and a unit of measurement, you sort of solve this problem, this design problem of inputting numbers, changing the numbers. And I guess in our case, we don't have a very ergonomic way of inputting values by number in JSFX because of the way that keyboard capture works. But never mind that, we will have an alternative that I think works even better than this, which is when you click and drag on top of the box, you will change the number. And that's better because you don't have to type, which is kind of annoying, and you don't have to click a bunch, which is also kind of annoying. There is one precedent to this design idea that I could remember and that I could find. And that is Nova. And perhaps there are other plugins by Tokyo Down Labs that do this as well. And yes, they do have knobs here, but they do have these boxes. Maybe I am in front of the box. I don't know because I'm not watching the stream on my second display, but this is exactly what I'm going for. This is exactly the kind of interface that I think works really well. They also have a couple here. And when I was playing around with this, I noticed, yeah, in many cases, we will want to have some kind of visualization, and perhaps clicking and dragging on the visualization makes more sense. So, for instance, for attack and release, we could draw the envelope, and you could click and drag around in the envelope in addition to the boxes or in substitution to the boxes. And this seems to work pretty well in terms of times and frequencies. I really like how, for instance, when you increase this attack, it changes the unit of measurement. Well, maybe not for attack, but for release it does. And not only that, it it seems to me that this has been calibrated in such a way that most of the range, and this is something you have to play around with and feel for yourself, but it seems like most of the range is dedicated to these lower values. And then when you get to here, 100 milliseconds is moving much faster under my cursor, it seems to me. I may be biased here. Anyway, it seems to work well for dB per octave. And it's kind of interesting. For all the other ones, it captures the cursor, but for slope, it doesn't. Probably for some technical reasons that have to do with the implementation. Oh, and this is kind of nice. I haven't noticed this before. If you just click, you are able to input values, and that would be ideal, but I don't think we can do that in JSFX very easily. But when you click here on this kind of box that has a predefined number of choices, then you get a drop-down menu, which is something that we can do in JSFX fairly easily using the menu drop-down kind of thing in JSFX. Or we could also render this. We could render a little box with a bunch of buttons, but I think that using the native JSFX thing, I think that will be easier. I can show you what I mean. So for instance, if I change the kind of band, we get this kind of menu, and this is super straightforward to do in JSFX. And for something like this, that would be good enough. And if we needed something a bit more clever with icons, for instance, say for instance here, that we would want to have little icons showing peaks, showing shelves and so forth, then this wouldn't cut it. We would have to do our own little design like this. And I suppose that the knobs are pervasive in audio effects because of skeuomorphism, because knobs were around in hardware and people are used to seeing knobs in audio gear. But, well, heck with tradition. We are going to do something different. And I'm thinking that, and even in this case here, there is a little box with the reading, and I can click and drag on the box as opposed to the knob. So the knob is really just a big waste of space. That's what it is. It's a big waste of space. And in the case that we need, which may be the case that sometimes we will need to show the range and where you are in the range, so to speak, the same way that the knob does. If we need that, we can always draw a little line above the box, below the box, behind the box somehow. Draw a little rectangle that displays progress. So it is sort of a slider in that sense. I will admit it is sort of a slider, but it takes less space and it looks more like everything else that is not audio plugins and digital audio workstations and so forth. So that's what we are going to try. And we have a precedent for this in our own effects that we have been working on. The volume control works like that. In this case, it's meant to go into the mixer control panel, MCP. So it's just one big knob, but it doesn't have to be just one. And in the way that we coded this, it's super straightforward to make this any size and have more of these guys. So that's what we're going to try and do today. Let's see what you all have to say. Fotis is here and Bo is here. Hello, Fotis. Hello, Bo. Hey, all. I jumped in right as Leandro shows my beloved lava reverb. Yeah, not only it looks great, it also sounds awesome. Have you experimented with anything with my JSFX EQ? Yeah, people who want to learn more about this can watch Wednesday's stream last week. Oh, you will be moving. Interesting. Yep, Inkscape is great. I have used it for drawing SVGs for the web. I have also drawn for papers. So when you're using LaTeX and producing academic papers, Inkscape is super handy because it's capable of exporting the vectors as a PDF. Question from me. Do you remember which stream it was where you and Aria started coding in JSFX? You started with combining different samples. It was in Aria's channel, ADDQD Sound, for people who don't know, about 1.5 years ago. And we did, I think that the first effect we did was a filter, because you asked for a filter, by the way. Yeah, I think that was the first stream. We had a couple streams together before that, and we coded in Lua, so REA scripts in that case. Yeah, that's what I said. That's what we are gonna try and explore. So we have been using this test effect last week for the knobs. And this is as far as we've gone in terms of knobs. It does look okay. I think that we managed to draw something that is pretty respectable in terms of knobs. So if it is ever the case that we find we actually need the knobs for whatever reason, these are working pretty well. They also reset on double click. You can hold a keyboard modifier to have finer precision and finer control over this. You can use the mouse wheel if you want. So a lot of this is fine, and we'll probably want to keep this. So I will rename the test effect into knob. And let's create another test effect. And I'm creating this in a test effect because I will want to play around with different little boxes and perhaps even that rectangle to show the progress, to show where you are in the range. And perhaps we can find some abstractions, some functions that we can put into our library before we go ahead and do that for the auto mixer itself. That's why I'm doing this in a test effect. We will want to import a library because for various reasons it will come in handy. And let's have the skeleton in place. I'm looking at the auto mixer as the basis for this, but in order to be able to use the library, we need to call certain functions in certain places. For instance, this. And that. And it's easier if I just copy this over. And I think that that's all the boilerplate that we have so far. In fact, at some point we will want to have a boilerplate for real as part of the documentation for the library. Well, it's as good time as any to do this. So let's go into the library. Oh, I cannot do comments like this because the add serialized thing will be picked up. This would be picked up by the compiler. Yeah, so that's the boilerplate that we have so far. And then we can start drawing. And I will use as reference one of the previous effects that has this. Perhaps the volume control, but also I want to take a peek at the waveform display. It also has something that allows you to click and drag to control a slider. And yeah, let's see what you all have to say. Yes. Yeah. When Arya and I started streaming together, we would do coding streams on his channel and music production stuff on my channel, the opposite of what we usually do. But then Arya preferred to switch it up so that the music production stuff is on his channel and the coding stuff is on my channel, because the people who are here like coding and the people who are there like music production, so that made more sense. And Tail is here. Hello, Tail. Do you have any advice for a soon-to-be teacher? You both have taught me so much. Well, do I have advice for a soon-to-be teacher? I have some, perhaps. When it comes to the more pedagogical stuff, I tend to prefer, and this is not going to be a surprise for anyone, visualizations whenever possible. Show, don't tell. And usually people grasp things better if you show them side by side instead of showing one after the other. This is going to sound a bit technical and a bit silly, but for me, it is a big thing. So many times people have one slide with one figure, another slide with another figure, and you sort of have to keep the context in your head. People are terrible, including you, the teacher. People are terrible with keeping track of stuff like that. So whenever possible, show things side by side. And I try and do that on my streams when it makes sense. So I try and show like the code and the thing that the code is producing side by side, that sort of thing. I always find that helpful. And on the not so pedagogical part of things and more like the whole, well, everything that is around that. I don't know how things are where you are, but when I thought more formally, when I was an instructor for an upper level course at an university, the thing that you have to keep in mind is that people are, at least where I was in the US, students tend to be very shy, and students tend to be very protective of their maybe privacy, maybe reputation. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but for instance, if you have a classroom kind of setting and you do some kind of activity and you expect people to ask questions, they won't ask questions. Because they're afraid of what other people may think, because they're afraid of maybe their question is silly, maybe the instructor is going to look down on them. So people, and I guess since you are going to be working with younger people, perhaps when they're younger, they will be even more protective of their reputation. So if you try and do anything that will make them stand out from the crowd, they will hate you for life for it. So the kind of thing that we do together here in our streams, where we show the stuff that isn't working, we talk about our failures, that's something that, as far as I understand, comes much later in life and comes just for certain people, not most people. Most people would have a terrible time looking silly on camera, trying to code and failing in a million ways like I do almost every day. So yeah, at least if you're in the US, my advice is never get into anything that will make any one person stand out. Never ask a question to a student directly. Never expect that people will ask questions, because they won't. If you have some kind of online interaction, make sure that students can be anonymous, at least with respect to other students. I, for one, prefer if students don't have to be anonymous with respect to the instructors, but some people find that advantageous as well because it encourages more people to participate in the conversation. And don't ever, 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 ever get into politics, religion, nothing that could be polemic. So if you're trying to teach, I guess you're going to be teaching computer stuff, there is a lot of politics around electronics these days because of the way that people see the web and people that misunderstand the web and technology in general, and with social networks and micro content and all of that. Lots of people will have misunderstandings, lots of people will have strong opinions, and if you ever pick one side, you'll be run out of town. So don't get into like net neutrality, don't get into the latest TikTok, don't pretend that you live in a separate world where the only thing that exists is the material you're teaching. And as I say this out loud, I am super disappointed with the educational system because that is the case, because of all these things that I said are true. I think it is a very sad scenario, and that's why I got out of the education and got into YouTube, because we have this sort of smaller group, but in this smaller group, we don't have to act that way. You can go on the chat and you can say stuff and everyone in the world will see what you are saying, and I find that great. There are downsides to this as well, in terms of diversity and access and all of that. So I do see the downsides. It's not like there is a perfect solution. But anyway, those are some of my thoughts and my experience having worked on this for a while. I was in a PhD program for 6 years, something like that, because I wanted to be an educator. Then I actually tried it and gave up because, or not gave up, decided to switch gears really, because what I'm doing here I think counts as education. I sure hope that you agree with that. Yeah, maybe they will find computers boring. Yeah, well, there is always a distribution. When there is a group of people, there will be people who find computers boring, people who find computers fascinating, and most people will be indifferent. That's for every topic. Some people will be taking our course because they were forced by the university, their parents, their company. And some people will be there even if they have to pay for it out of their pocket. I guess in this case, at this age, not out of their own pockets, but you get what I mean. Yeah. Don't ever talk about politics. Don't ever talk about religion. And depending on where you are, don't ever talk about soccer. Where were we? I have a lot of ideas and thoughts and feelings when it gets to this topic. So I got sidetracked. So we are looking at two plugins as references, the volume and the waveform. Which one is shorter? The volume one is shorter. Great. We're going to look at that one. And in that case, we have only one slider that we care about, which is this one. So it seems like in order to have a knob, which I guess I'm going to stop calling it a knob or even a slider, because it's not really going to be represented as a slider and it's not going to be represented as a knob. So I will call this a parameter that we control via the interface. So for a parameter that we control via the interface, we always need to have a slider to back it up, because the slider really is the source of truth. This is what will be stored in the REAPER project when you save, and will be restored when you open the project again. And this is really the value. I was actually thinking about this, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 places where a value exists. So a value like volume can be in 5 different places. The slider itself, the user interface will have its own notion of the knob. This. Then there are derived values. That's number 3. So for instance, this, the volume linear, is derived from the volume dB. Then there is the serialized block, which in this case we don't have to worry about because we are only serializing sliders, but in general, and in the automixer that will be the case, we will have to serialize some extra values. So that's the 4th place. And the 5th place in the case of the automixer is the GMEM, the global memory that is used for syncing across plugin instances. So the same slider exists in at least 5 places in the automixer, which if you think about it, it is crazy. And it's super complicated to think about what is the source of truth when there are 2 values that are out of sync. How do I sync them? Who has the precedence? Depending on the context, and there are like 5 or 6 different workflows you have to think through. Super complicated. And it's not even fleshed out yet, because if you save a project with the automixer and reload the project, then the sliders will be forgotten. So we have to think about that, but that's for another time. So let's have perhaps a volume slider, why not? That's good because it shows derived values. So we are given the value in dB and we want it in linear. And I guess in the init block, you will need to set, you will have to restate the default, the minimum, the maximum, and the step. Not this one though. But the step you will have to set. Oh, I see why the volume is not defining that. It is because it is not restating these values. When you're holding command, for instance, which is the keyboard modifier you use to do fine adjustments, this step changes. Interesting. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, anytime you have a user interface and things get a bit interesting, they get complicated. But isn't it sad though? Isn't it sad? Isn't the state of affairs sad? We should be able to talk about these things. We should be able to disagree without hating each other. Oh well, it is what it is. And from where it is controlled, yeah. Exactly. All these different workflows that will affect some of these variables and how they should be synced across. I don't have a full solution for this yet. I started thinking about it. At least I identified all the places that matter. Now the next part will be to think about all the workflows and what needs to happen. So I guess I will end up with a pretty diagram of how information flows in the app. And hopefully we will squash all those bugs. Can I add another thing to the list of comments about education? It does not matter the information that you're trying to convey. It does not matter if it is right or wrong, good or bad. All that matters is that you are entertaining. Education is my point of view here, of course, education is not about conveying information. It's not about teaching people how to think. It's not about inspiring people to be better. No, it is just about entertainment. If you want to capture their attention, and if you want to get your point across, and if you want to get good reviews as an educator, entertainment. People are there waiting for a show. Has always been like that, will always be like that. You're not in the business of conveying information. You are in the business of entertainment. Same here on YouTube, by the way. I am trying to entertain people. And if you can sneak in some nice piece of information, something that is like a good value to live by, all the better. But it's all about entertainment. I bought a new pen tablet and got lost playing Corel Painter. Yeah, I got one of those tablets and I played around with writing software for it on a couple of streams, like 1 month worth of streams last year. But other than that, I couldn't find myself using it a lot. I'm looking forward to the new update in macOS because there will be this Freeform app in macOS 13. And supposedly on that app, I think that app will be good for the pen and the tablet. But every other software for the tablet, I don't really get, I don't get into the workflow. I don't like it a lot. Maybe Apple will do something better. We'll see. Yeah, it will be called the Freeform app. Looking forward to trying that out. So I'm sort of restating the volume plugin here. That's on purpose because I want to identify what is the core of what makes a parameter on the interface. And then I will try to extract some of that into the library. Or maybe we can just keep chatting about education. I can do that all day. Oh, something interesting happens here. If you want to change the slider, you have to change the graphics notion of that slider. And you also have to define this slider function. Why am I defining the slider function outside the slider block? That's a good question. It's probably something that could be different. And I admit that it is a bit silly for me to have a function like this, but again, I am trying to identify what is the core of what makes a control on the interface a parameter. So this function is the place where we compute derived values, coming back to my little diagram here. The source of truth in this case is the slider, and I want to compute a derived value based on it. So that's the intent of this line. And again, the source of truth is the slider, and I'm updating the graphics notion of that slider. And I noticed, I was thinking about this since John is watching. I was thinking about one implementation difference between the way that I did my button, my parameter, and the way that you did yours. So you had that survey that told you, I think the number was 1.5. So when you click and drag, you use this factor of 1.5 to translate between the pixels of the mouse being dragged and the internal representation of a knob. And I think that only works if your internal representation of what the knob state is normalized. So it goes between 0 and 1, for instance. So all the way to the left is 0 and all the way to the right is 1, regardless of the range of the parameter. In this case, the range is from 0.1 to 10, but it would normalize this to go from 0 to 1. And in that case, you can have a fixed let's say, coefficient, a fixed coefficient to translate between pixels of the click and drag into this normalized value of between 0 and 1. So I think that that's how you're implementing your knobs, if I remember and understand correctly. But in my case, I implemented the thing differently. I am not translating from pixels into a normalized value between 0 and 1. I'm translating from pixels into this dimension, into zoom. So in this case, between pixels and values that go from 0.1 to 10. And what this means is that my ratio needs to be different. It's not 1.5, I guess in this case it would be 0.15, because the range is 10 times, it's not even 10 times, it's at kind of 11 times. No, it is 10 times. So yeah, the range here is about 10 times the range of your normalized knob. And that's why you can do a single coefficient, the 1.5 thing that you asked about on the REAPER forums, and that seemed to be the consensus. So your 1.5 thing only works because you're in this normalized space. And in my case, I am not doing that. Perhaps I should, but that's not what I'm doing right now. And we will see that when we get to that part of the code, which is down here. Ah, I know what Xcoli draw is. I don't know what this is. Okay, it's one of those personal wikis kind of thing. Nice. Yeah, so when you go 100 pixels with your cursor, you are doing a whole knob turn, which means, I guess I was talking about this normalized value between 0 and 1, and another way of thinking about that is the angle of the knob. So a whole knob turn, let's say 250 degrees, corresponds to 100 pixels. And in my case, I'm not thinking of knob turns as the internal state of the button. I'm thinking about that in terms of dB, in this case, of course. Yeah. And if you need it not normalized, you convert the slider later to the true value. Yeah, well, you can always go from normalized to not normalized and back. You may get a little glitches because of, what is it called? The precision errors when you're doing multiplication and division with floating points. But for the most part, with the kinds of numbers that we need, that's negligible. So yeah, it's something to think about in our own implementation here. Perhaps I should not be thinking of this knob value in terms of dB. I should be thinking of it in terms of normalized values, let's say. Not degrees, because we are not doing the knob thing anymore. All right, so in the block section, again, here I am comparing two files, so I need to put them side by side, not switch between them like this. That's bad. This is good. Ooh, this is slider needed situation is kind of tricky. Let's copy this whole block and get rid of stuff that is specific to the plugin to try to get the essence of the knob. The essence of the parameter, I said. And you know what? In this plugin, I made the scroll wheel. In this plugin, I did not make the scroll wheel of the mouse change the slider. On this plugin, I made the scroll wheel change the value of the slider, and I think I prefer this version. I don't like the scroll wheel changing values, and I think that in most of the Reaper interface that does not happen. Let's consult our design references real quick, because I think that in those the scroll wheel also doesn't change the value of the knob. God damn it, the parameter doesn't change the parameter. I remember playing around with Nova, and Nova changed the values with the scroll wheel, but yeah, the scroll wheel does not change the values here, and it does not change the values there. So Reaper doesn't do it, Pages doesn't do it, Inkscape doesn't do it, and our plugins are doing it. Perhaps they should not. So anything that has to do with scroll will go away. So this can go away. And maybe in some select couple places, we can have the scroll wheel do something. For instance, here, the scroll wheel changes the bandwidth. And many people are used to this. So perhaps if we ever do an EQ, we should have that. But truth be told, you can do the same with holding Shift and clicking and dragging. And I think I prefer that. And this conditional has to do with the wheel. We can get rid of that. And we were just talking about the coefficients to translate between pixels and units of measurement that are normalized or not, and blah, blah, blah. These are my coefficients. Again, note how I am translating from pixels to dB. And I get the point of translating from pixels or knob turns into a normalized value, but I kind of like having to do this adjustment per knob, which is more work. But I think that depending on the unit of measurement, you would like the clicking and dragging to go at a different speed. So coming back to Nova, the frequency here is going from, let's say, 10 to 110 hertz. So it's going 100 of the unit of measurement. And it's going from 10 to 110 in, let's say, this much movement of the mouse. But for something like attack, it will go from 200 to 220 or 120 with this much movement of the mouse, so that you have more control over the attack than you have over the frequency, because 10 milliseconds matters more than 10 hertz. That's the kind of thinking that I'm having here. So I think that it makes sense for me to have to adjust this by hand, and to have to adjust this by hand for fine adjustments and coarse adjustments, which is a lot more work. And perhaps it will be less consistent, but I think that it will be better. I hope it will be better. It will be less consistent, but better. Yeah, consistency is often nice, but not always. And then this slider function is super cool because it will quantize the value. And here the step is dependent on the fine adjustment, and that's why we have the default, the minimum, the maximum, but not the step. And Another interesting thing is that the range of the actual slider and the range of the user interface parameter, not slider, not knob parameter, they are different ranges. I made it this way because the slider with this much range was kind of annoying to use, but I think that there is another consequence of doing it this way, and it has to do with automation. I think that the automation will respect the range of my knob, my slider, I should say. So yeah, it goes from minus 15 to 15, which corresponds to these values. So even if the slider is not on the page, like in this example, it is not. Oh, it is. In this example, it is on the page. Why is it on the page? It should be hidden. That's silly. Anyway. Now that I have automation, it's snapping back. But anyway, even if you don't have the slider on the page, it's still valuable to think about this range because of automation. All right. And then this is for resetting. And I will keep this around because I will say that this has to do with the drawing itself, like the drawing of the button. Well, not quite actually, because I don't want to have the background of the whole plugin. I will want to have a rectangle that is the drawing area of this button. So let's start this adaptation. Or maybe not. Let's finish what we have to see if we broke something in the process of converting things, and then we will play around with this. Yeah, it seems fine. It seems like double click is working. Scroll wheel is no longer working because we deactivated that. And naturally our volume should be hidden, but we will not hide it now because we want to be able to see the slider value, which is good for debugging. If I need it, okay, I read that. For your information, in our plugins, we only use the scroll wheel in combination with a modifier key to prevent accidental changes. That's a good point, actually. It does make me nervous when the scroll wheel is so easy to use to change values. In fact, I remember in a previous version of Inkscape, like we just saw in Inkscape right now, if you use the scroll wheel, it does not change the numbers anymore. But it used to be the case that it did change the numbers, and it was really a nightmare. So back in pre-1.0 versions of Inkscape, it didn't work all that well in macOS. It was kind of a port using the GTK version from Linux. It was a bit of a mess, but the point I'm making here is that if you had some kind of control that was long, it would scroll. So let's push these two panes one on top of the other so that it scrolls like this. So think about it this way. You were able to scroll and you were able to change values with the scroll wheel as well in old versions of Inkscape. Okay, no longer the case, but what would happen is you would be scrolling to get to a field and your cursor would go from being outside any button to being inside a button, and you would stop scrolling and start changing the value of that parameter. That used to happen, and that was terrible. So yeah, I think that requiring a modifier key makes sense. And in the case of req, it does not. It doesn't require any modifiers. But I think that perhaps using the scroll wheel to change values is a bad thing to do in general. I think we will try to avoid that design language. So if we are doing something like this, we will hold a modifier and click and drag. Yeah, scroll wheel is for scrolling, changing stuff, click and drag. That's going to be our way of doing things. If you use a scroll wheel to change a value, it's polite to include a setting to reverse its action for people whose brains are back to front. Yeah, we will try to avoid using the scroll wheel to change values. Scroll wheel is for scrolling, and changing values will require click and drag. And Go Cheese is here. Hello. Does anyone know if you are able to call a Win API function from EL2? I've done some research and it seems Lua cannot. As far as I know, the answer is negative. I suppose you're talking about EL2 in the context of REA scripts, not in the context of JSFX, because in JSFX, the amount of things you can do is even more reduced. It's even more constrained. But you can use EL2 to write REA scripts. And you're asking if you can use some Win API functions. I don't think so. Not the functions that are not made available by REAPER itself. There are some extensions that may give you more functionality, but even these extensions, I don't think will allow you to just do API calls directly. I don't know much about this, but yeah, I don't seem to recall any major features that are available in one language and not in the other. I remember seeing even a couple instances where in the documentation would talk about some functions in the EL2 section and would not talk about them in the Lua section, but the functions were still available in Lua. The binding was there, they just forgot to document it. So yeah, to boil down my answer, the summary is I don't think you can do that directly. You will have to always work through the API functions that are made available in REAPER for REA scripts. And if you ever find yourself writing EL2 instead of Lua because you want a certain API feature, try to use it in Lua. It may exist. Or ask for it in the forums. It may be added. I think at this point, Lua is the preferred language. Perhaps the only caveat is that Lua may be slightly slower when you're doing lots of heavy lifting. If you're processing audio in your REA script, then EL2 may be still a bit faster or significantly faster depending on what you're doing. But Lua is the recommended language. So if a function exists in EL2 and does not exist in Lua, then it should exist in Lua. Next, let's take a look at this drawing so that in this plugin that we were playing with, the volume plugin, the whole interface is a big interactive area. But now we want to extract this so that we can have several buttons on the screen. So let's say that we have, not buttons, parameters, I want to say. So I'm going to start this by doing some variable extractions. Or maybe we'll call this the interactive area instead of parameter. like this. And you can see what I am going for here. I am starting this variable extraction and everything because I am looking ahead into what the library functions will look like for abstractions that work on these parameters. And then instead of calling background color, I guess I will still call background color with a dark gray. But I will draw a rectangle for the button. And you know what could be cute? We could have a rounded rectangle. Though most of the Reaper interface is not rounded. Well, these buttons are rounded. These are not. Let's find a couple more buttons. These are not. This isn't. This is not. And then these are not round. Isn't that fascinating? The mute button here is rounded. The radius is very small, but it is a round button. The same button. I always thought it was the same button, but it's not. Because here, it is not rounded. That's interesting. So I guess the winning is not rounded. But yeah, I'll have mine rounded because I don't like sharp corners. There you go. So we will have our rounded buttons. They will have a different background color depending on if they are active, if you're hovering on them, or if you're not interacting with them at all. You know, I want them to stand out from the background. The background is 900, so I'll shift everything by 1. Like that. And let's change these now that we have extracted everything into variables. I will comment this out for now. And let's change this so that it does not occupy the whole interface. It needs 6 parameters, and I'm not giving them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's better. Yeah, but this difference in color is not enough. We will need to go 200 of a difference. So instead of 800, let's do 700 and shift everything by 1. And now this is nice. And it can be a bit difficult to see the rounded rectangle, but because it's very black on black kind of thing. But I think that when you hover over it and when you click, then yeah, it makes it stand out. And if I click and drag outside the button, it doesn't work. If I click and drag inside the button, it does work. Excellent. Now let's put the label back in. Oh yeah, we were following this convention in which X and Y, width and height were on the same line. Well, whatever. No trailing commas when calling functions. Hey, that's very large. We have extra small and extra extra small. Let's see what extra extra small looks like. Extra extra small seems to be the one for me, which is sad. It means we probably need to go either further down in our design scale and perhaps shift everything, but whatever. This does it for me. And I don't want that in this context. And I'm saying that I don't want this plus in this context. And I do want everything to be just a little bit wider. But in terms of height, I think we got it, which is surprising because we did this with no reference, but I think we got it. And in terms of width, in this case, I would probably go with like forcing to make it spacious. And it bugs me that I gave the exact coordinates and told the text to be centered, but it doesn't seem to be centered. I want to play around with the height to see if JSFX thinks that it is centered, because I think JSFX thinks it is centered. See, yeah, JSFX thinks that it is centered, but when you make it, and when it is a large button, it looks centered, but when it is small enough, it is easy to see that it's not centered. The reason for that, by the way, has to do with the bounding box of the letters defined in the font. Vertical alignment is always tricky, and the font defines a bounding box for the character, which takes in account things like ascenders and descenders. So for instance, the P has a descender, it goes below the baseline, and then the bounding box of the font file will define how things are supposed to align vertically. And it seems like in this font, it is not doing a great job, or JSFX is not doing a great job of respecting that, so it goes ever so slightly out of alignment. And this will bug the hell out of me forever, but I think I'm gonna let it go. I think I'm just gonna let it go. And on the rest of the Reaper interface, if I double click, I reset stuff. And if I alt click, I don't reset stuff. Oh, alt click and drag has a nice concept where it snaps back. So you can play around, see if you like it. And if you like it, then you can let go of option and then let go of the button. But if you don't like it, you let go of the mouse button and it snaps back. Let's not implement that behavior. We will implement double click. And in some places in the user interface, when you option click, it kind of removes something. But I guess removing is not the same as resetting. So double click to reset, but option click will not do anything special. And command click will be fine tuning. So there you go. This is, it needs to be just a little bit smaller. Yeah, this is perfect. For this slider, this is perfect. The only unfortunate thing is that it doesn't capture the cursor. So if you try to continue dragging, it doesn't go any further. You have to come back and click and drag again. So we will have to be smart about the ranges. That's true of any knob in JSFX. Well, this is so fast that I don't get to go to the top of the interface. So again, I guess we'll need to be smart about the ranges and the coefficients so that this is never a problem. But ideally, we would be able, we are not able to do that in JSFX. Ideally, we would capture the cursor like a Nova plugin does. When you start dragging, it captures the cursor so you can keep going up. Can continue going up forever. Anyway, that's impossible to do in JSFX, so never mind that. But hey, here is the result of our coding session, and I'm very happy with the result. It is subdued, it is minimalistic, it works very well. People are probably going to look at this and know what to do. Takes very little space, is more in line with the rest of the operating system and with the rest of the design language used everywhere. I'm happy. I think that this is going to fly. I think that this is what we'll do. I count that as a success. So we have a knobless knob. Yeah, sure thing, go cheese. Yeah, you can watch this later, and we are checking out now. So tomorrow we will be back and we will be, I guess, looking at the hard problem of finding an abstraction for this, and or looking at the hard problem of synchronizing values that represent the same quantity, that represent the same thing, but there are all these kinds of different points of view for the same thing. So gmem and sliders and derived values and the user interface and the serialized section. We will be looking at the hard problem of finding a way to sync all of these. And when we have both of these questions answered, we will return to the auto mixer and implement our sliders there. Sliders that will sync across plugin instances, sliders that will look good. It will be amazing. For now, thank you to Bo and Goat Cheese and Mage and Tail and John and Fotis for joining me here on the chat. Thank you to everyone else who is watching this in the future. And make sure to watch the video posted yesterday on the Toucan Studios channel about Limiter 3. I am in that video. I introduced Limiter 3 in that video, so make sure you watch that. And thank you very much. See you tomorrow. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for watching the stream. You know how great it has been. Or maybe it sucked, and I am glad that you stuck with me. And soon we'll all will be back together for some more coding or talking or chilling. The next time I'll be streaming.